Hello everybody, this is the makeup lecture for Wednesday, November 1, which is the day that I'm away at the conference, and the evening at 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, November 1 is the deadline for submitting a bullet point draft if you want to for assignment 1. So hopefully you're having a look at this before that, because there's a few exercises that you may want to include in your summary reflection. We're looking at a little bit of time thinking about peer review again. This is something you'll be returning to over the next few weeks. And a few more tips in terms of just making your writing more dynamic. When you're using description and when description and placemaking is such an important part of your writing, also you've got to balance that out, as I've said before, with really be aware of pacing and what you can do to make it very engaging and dynamic. Because, description is like slowing down to smell the roses. So what can you do to speed it up? A little bit of a preview for the interview workshop, which we'll be conducting the following week on Wednesday, the 8th of November, and also a little bit of a preview on telling stories with photos, and we'll be exploring audio and video as well in between research across those next 2 weeks, because we've got that extra half hour. So just some thoughts about peer review reflections and some feedback that I've been reading. Mostly really a helpful and really rewarding experience. And again, as I said, when there is detail and specific feedback, that's generally preferable for everybody involved. Some people did say that they almost wish that their partners had gone further and would give them, would actually really get in and get really meaty. So, but that can take practice, and it takes a little while to get the courage to actually, go in and be constructively critical. But I will be slowly, as you say, building up the skill and introducing you to that ability. And I do encourage you to tackle that, because it is a really good skill to have as a writer. And it is, again, it's very much about what you put in, and you can learn a lot about your own writing by editing others. Don't be alarmed if you're getting very different responses. That's probably just underlying the fact that, different readers respond to things differently and will pick things up, very different things. And that's why it's really, in the end, it's up to you whether you actually follow through on the feedback that you're getting or not. But if you do get repeated feedback, that's always a good sign that maybe you should actually really stop and take notice of that. If there's a few people who are confused by something or feeling that the pace could be lifted a bit at a certain point, take that on board. And also, it's another way of learning by doing, and it's one that takes practice. But just a few tips in terms of your writing and making good writing. Here we go. Internets, huh? These are some things that, if you're thinking, what can I say? What are some other things I can add into my feedback for other people? Does the writing sound natural? Sometimes people overwrite, and that's something that people can do. Certainly in the early stages, everyone's trying to be a better writer, a good writer, and, can stuff a sentence full of adjectives. Or really, this is comparing an ebony abyss claimed the den when he could just say the room went dark. If there's a simple and direct way to say something, that's often the best because it's the clearest. So does something sound natural? Does it sound a little bit too forced? This is one. Now, I wouldn't say this is necessarily true in each genre. There are some genres where the writing does call attention to itself, but in prose, certainly in plot-driven types of narrative, the writing can get in the way of the story, if it's too self-conscious and too constructed. So is there room for the story to come through? And this is saying the fix. Just remember, again, that practice, always reading it aloud, that will tend to highlight if something's a bit unnatural or doesn't quite work. It just doesn't seem like to really flow. do you need to say something? If it's obvious, you may not need to say something. So if someone had someone sort of said, the star was in the sky when it's nighttime, we know that there's a star in the sky. And this example is the only luminescence came in the form of the full moon, which shone down from a starry sky. And you don't need to say that the full moon shone down from a starry sky. That would be obvious. So this is just about kill your darlings. You've probably heard that phrase before in writing courses. Tight is very, very good. Getting rid of excess words. Definitely have a rule. Try and keep no more than one and in each sentence, and definitely no more than two if you can, unless you're really emulating Patrick Levermer's style. But most people these days tend to prefer. Again, this is about keeping in the active voice. Even try cutting out all the adjectives and adverbs, and just very slowly, one by one, bring them back in and see, and really, be ruthless and think, is that adding anything? Is it worth being there? Or am I just repeating what I said before with the other word? Sometimes people do that. They'll actually say, and words that you can definitely get out are very, really. Those extra words that don't necessarily need to be there, you'll find that if you just go through and prune them out, that can also add a lot of strength and pace to your writing. Be careful of doing information dumps, they're called, when you're trying to give the backstory and suddenly a conversation, for example, can sound like a technical instruction pamphlet or the history of the building. So just bit by bit, they're saying it's a good idea to try and put in information. And that's one thing I know in science fiction groups, that's feedback that often gets given. Well, suddenly we've got a big information dump these days. And it's hard to avoid because you need to get the information in there. So it's a little bit of a practice and a bit of honing things to actually start to spruce it through. And he's saying one of the ways that you can start to identify an information dump is if there is more than more than one and maybe there's 2 or 3 pieces of information about a personal place in a sentence. So maybe drip feed it through the piece, add a bit more, a few sentences down rather than having it all in the one place. We've talked about cliches. I don't think we need to do. Using colour. Colour can really add dimension and shape and texture to your word, except if you overdo it. Again, this is being careful about overdoing it. The Emerald River round its way through the dusty hills, which were dirty off-white, tinged with streaks of brownish yellow. They're saying just maybe one colour is, sometimes it's that less is more effect. And unpack sentences. Like this is something that I tend to do a lot. I have a whole sentence in a paragraph. And there are times when a whole sentence in a paragraph is appropriate if you're wanting to have a slower pace or a reflective pause or a bit more of a lilting kind of feel. However, mostly as well, that can start to get a bit confusing for readers because there's just too much on the page. And it's always a good idea to, as well as getting rid of the necessary words, to see if you can actually go back and pick out some points where it's going to be more effective to break those sentences into 2 or 3 shorter sentences. And it's saying, this is perfect for peer review because it's more like the second draft. For the first draft, this is what you want. You want to just let go and put huge, big, long sentences and stuff them full with adjectives. That what comes out, do it. But then you go back and you prune and you get it all very, very polished. And that's why there's that famous phrase, kill your darlings. Another very important way that a lot of people keep in mind when they're actually trying to keep the pace up in their work is to actually just use action and just, this is a very common opening and an approach to an opening of a story in a lot of genres, is to just drop people right in the middle of an event. If you think about a moment in your trip that really stands out, that was really dramatic and exciting, that might well be the opening of your story. You can come back and tell more information to explain it later, but to drop them right in is very helpful. I'm just going to go back here. you might want to have a look at these. I've just gone through an article looking at tips, so I won't go through these in depth now, but these are helpful tips from a few different travel writers, and a lot of them will be talking about using action and keeping it dynamic as well. Here's some examples. This is an opening of a book. Alive, still alive, alive again. Awakening was hard, as always. The ultimate disappointment. It was a struggle to take in enough air to drive off nightmare sensations of asphyxiation. Lilith, Iapo, lay gasping, shaking with the force of effort. We don't know what year it is. We don't know what the building looks like. We know that something very dramatic and very intriguing is happening, and slowly the details will start to be drip-fed into this piece. It begins at a moment where someone's fighting for their life. Something's at stake, and that makes it dramatic. So think again, look for those moments. So this is similar to going back to those plotting exercises. What are those moments that were dramatic and active and would just make your heart pump? They're ones to actually really include. Not all the time, but for pace, and if you're using a lot of descriptive paragraphs in between, it's really helpful to think about and place events and action in between all your pieces. I'll come back to a way of doing that as well in a few. I'm going to talk about on the page online a lot of the way that we pace and break up bits of text is to add visuals. And we started to look at different ways and the principles of taking good photos, what's involved, and that, the rule of thirds, and trying to give dimension to a flat image, and thinking about where you're placing your camera so it's not always at normal eye level, trying to see and create new visions of the world. Taking that principle a step further, you can then start to create a series of visions of the world, to start to create new visions through storytelling about those places. And you can use your photos to actually take people through a journey and seeing places sculpturally from different perspectives, from different angles, from different contexts within that place. And this is what's called a photo essay. And it can really drive your story. If you think about it, if you're doing a story, perhaps you're doing a piece about a journey to Paris. Are you just going to have one photo, or will there be a few? And ideally, maybe those photos in themselves will start to tell a story. If you're sent out on assignment, you would want to be thinking about what photos do I need to tell this story? And as a general rule, this is the guide. And again, it is formulaic, but it's always good to have a formula that you can personalize and innovate as you see fit. But there's a signature shot, the shot that tells people where they are. And it illustrates the scene, like we saw the setting. But this is the one that's the establishing shot that tells people where they are. The signature shot is sort of like the summary, the one that's like the keynote piece of this particular story or this particular thematic that you're building up with images. And as well as a wide-angle setting shot, there's also close-up details. They're really important to add texture. And it's what you can do with this medium of a camera. You can go in, you can go out, you can go high, you can make it in low light or highlight. Portraits, people who are there in the space, they will add so much depth and characters, life stories to this place. Interactions between people will show about family dynamics or a culture of a place. They're very lively, and they can add a lot of oomph to the piece as well. How-to sequences if you're reporting on particular crafts in an area, or the way that a coffee is being made. You'll see an example that we're going to be looking at shortly. So what elements would you need to show so that people can understand the process that you're describing? And is there a moment that, like closing up shop at the end of the day, that's the cliche closer, leaving town, or a moment where that will always be, creates a sense of the final cup of coffee when it arrives on the table after the long process of grown and being brewed and made. That's the closer, the coffee. That moment. This link is actually to a whole lot of really good examples of different types of photo essays. For those of you who are photographers, you may want to take the time to actually have a look through some of these. This is one of my particular favourites, Trouble Shared. And think about, when you're looking at this one, how did they get access? This is a lot of this is incredible because it's so intimate, and the people who are vulnerable are so trusting. Is that trust betrayed? I don't know. I actually think that there's a sense of naturalness. It's certainly a sense of being a fly on the wall, but there's also a sense of a conversation. People are aware this is happening, and the photographer takes moments to actually have people look directly into the camera. Why do you think they're looking into the camera? Why is there such a lack of expression in these faces? What is the photographer trying to say? And why include all of these particular scenes? Well, the piece is titled Trouble Shared, and it's about young mothers struggling in poverty. So the idea with this photo is to actually highlight what they're dealing with and tell their story in a very human way without them having to necessarily say too much. This is a case of the photo paints 1,000 words. So a very powerful piece by that particular photographer. Photo most viral. Have a look at this. Now this is different because actually this idea of what a photo essay is can change online, because in online world it's not necessarily a world where narrative is king. The principle that actually makes the online space come to life is repetition and variation. This is a photo stream that went viral, and it was taken from a fright house at that moment when everyone who was visiting was absolutely terrified. And they were just really dynamic shots. And again, it worked. Repetition and variation. So I'll let you have a look at those through on another time. But thinking about these elements, having a look at that and think, what sort of shots would you take if you were sent on an assignment to a remote village to look at their local weaving practices and do a story about that? So they're expecting both photos and text. Don't worry about the text for now. Just think about what photos you would do. What's your signature shot? What's your establishing shot? What's your close-up? Well, a signature shot could be the weaving in action. It could be something being made. An establishing shot could be a whole group of women doing that, or bartering over the weaving products, or of the area, the village itself. Perhaps with one of the weavers in the foreground but the village in the background. And you can actually get a sense of both. Close-ups. Just think in your mind, what sort of close-ups would you expect to see? The hands weaving through the strings, dyeing of the wool, the women's faces deep in concentration as they're actually weaving, the money being exchanged as people actually sell their wares in a market, or agents come and sell their wares. portrait, of course, that's the women who were making it. The dealers who come, the tourists who come, they'd also be an important part of that. The children who play, who are watching nearby, if you have permission. The interactions, what sort of interactions would you be looking for and were hoping to capture in your photos? The women laughing as they're making their weaving products. The bartering as people are coming in to try and buy those weaving products. Perhaps the interaction between couples. The woman showing her husband some of her weaving products, or dressing her children. And how-to sequences, all the various stages that would be involved in that process, from picking the dyes, finding the dyes, making up the dye products, dyeing the fabrics, stringing them up in the loom, whether they actually do spinning or something. I'm not an expert on weaving, but all the various products that would be involved towards finally hanging up the finished product. So you'd want to spend ideally a bit of time there if you could, and find out before you went how long they take to do this weaving. What would be your closer? A tourist walking off with a traditional artifact, perhaps. An empty loom, perhaps. So there are different things, and what you'd probably do is when you went out, you'd take all these sorts of different photographs, and you'd make those decisions afterwards. But it's also a good idea to go out and think about plot. What do I need? Oh, I need this, I need this, I need this. And then the more variety of image that you have, the more in terms of a mix of close-up, a mix of wide, a mix of action, a mix of portrait shots, the more you've got to actually put together that, as I say, sculptural, three-dimensional story about what's actually happening in this space. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes now because I want you to just note down what sort of shots would you do if you were doing a feature on a cafe. So there's a wealth of many different shots that you could have in that. I've lost my mouse for a second, sorry. Just trying to find it again. Hang on. Here we go, good. I'll show you a very good photo essay about a coffee house. So there you go. There's your establishing shot. This is a vibrant inner city New York coffee house. And that could almost be the signature shot, couldn't it? Life in New York. It's very much happening around the cafe. People congregate there. It's a big part of the culture. People care about their coffee. They take their pets. They sit there and gaze out into space. They rendezvous with their lovers. Everything and everybody is happening in the cafe. Deals are made. Relationships are broken. Or not. And as you can see, it's serious business. Now that's a moment, isn't it? Smelling the beans. And look at how they've placed this shot to give a lot of dimension to that. So that's not a flat shot. We've actually seen a really interesting shape in the foreground, and the person's face is really well lit. And they're doing I can almost smell that coffee. And there you go, there's another moment. People queuing up avidly because the moment of making that perfect coffee. Is she the barista? And here we go. Here's an interesting angle. Again, a little bit of the magic of the coffee, the importance of this golden beverage, looking at it from a new angle. And it's a very serious business, you can see. bellissimo. And the guy's even holding up the fan for him to just have the perfect moment. And again, there's a lot of fetish about coffee, isn't it? But it's just someone's just hung out in this cafe, at least for a day, I'd say, and just gathered all these moments that they've probably experienced themselves, but just capture the sense of the atmosphere and the pleasures of this space from very different, unusual angles, but also giving it a real sense of character and a sense of craft. This place does good coffee by the look of it. And there's... Which do you think was the closer? That's sort of almost like a mix of the signature shot and the that's the signature shot in some ways, isn't it? It looked like in some ways this was the closer, the gag at the end of the story. But you really get a sense of the place, don't you? You get a sense of the people there, and the focus upon this art of coffee making. This is a place that I would expect to have really good coffee and people coming in and it being vibrant and lots of conversation and a well-loved place in that neighbourhood. And if you're doing video reports, it's very similar, that you would want to, at the same time, get as many video shots, as much coverage to help you tell a story as possible. This is a little video that was put together by the BBC, but it's a really good general guide to the sorts of shots you need if you're actually filming things on the fly as they're happening. So, because you want to have that in your brain, okay, I need to get this shot, I need to get that shot, and I need to cut them together. As I said, this isn't a production thing, but just to give you an idea, if you're out there with your mobile phone, what you might want to do. I'll put a microphone near the screen.
This very simple piece illustrates the use of sequential shooting in DV filmmaking. Sequences are the fundamental building blocks of any good bit of telly. A sequence generally consists of close-up on the hands, close-up on the face, a wide shot, an over-the-shoulder shot, and then another shot from a different angle. Be creative. Side shot, low shot, something from on high. It's up to you. We shoot sequentially because these shots always cut together. If you film in sequences, you will get usable material every time. It is important to shoot the 5 shots in the order given. Why? Because close-up on the hands, close-up on the face, and the wide will always cut together, and cut together cleanly. Whereas your other angle or the over-the-shoulder may not be nearly so useful.
When they're talking about things cutting together, that's a thing that happened in editing, is if you've just shot these random shots, sometimes they can jar when they're being edited together, or they might be a what's called a jump cut, where it doesn't quite match and people go, "Ooh, that was a strange cut," and they're suddenly reminded that this is an edited piece instead of being drawn into the story. I think that rule has been broken a few times, and certainly with YouTube aesthetics, which are much more raw, shall we say, and lo-fi. That's not necessarily as much of a no-no as it was in past, but nevertheless, it's always good to have that material so you've got the option of making sure something cuts together rather than not. We will come back and we'll look a little bit more at audio and video in the next couple of weeks as well, and give you a chance to actually do some filming. However, I just wanted to introduce this idea of when you're adding your visual elements, maybe it's not just 1 or 2 photos or just a caption. It could just be a quite dynamic piece in itself. And that actually gives a sense of kinesthetically the space, atmospherically the culture, the characters, the interactions. So these are tools at your disposal as well. Eric Newby, he actually is a really dynamic writer, and his adventure story, A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, is a classic, and many people really enjoy this piece. He plays the role of the garrulous amateur who walks in foolishly where he possibly shouldn't. But Eric Newby, he starts his story because he used to actually, prior to taking up travel writing and going on this mountaineering trip, he worked in fashion. Look at the way he wrote. The first couple of paragraphs are pretty classic and a bit flat, but then suddenly it comes to life. And look at the change as I'm reading this. With all the lights on and the doors shut to protect us from the hellish draught that blew up the back stairs, the fitting room was like an oven with mirrors. There were 4 of us jammed in it. Hyde Clark, the designer, Millie, a very contemporary model girl with none of the normal protuberances, the sour-looking fitter in whose workroom the dress was being made, and Newbie. Things were not going well. It was the week before the showing of the 1956 spring collection, a time when the vendeurs crouched behind their little cream and gold desks, doodling furiously, and the directors swooped through the vast empty showrooms, switching off lights in a frenzy of economy, plunging whole wings into darkness. Hyde Clark was sitting on his haunches, ramming pins into Grand Guignol, a designer dress, like a riveter. That dress is doomed. I know it's doomed. Bother! I've swallowed a pin. Pins! Quickly, pins! The fitter, a thin woman like a well-dressed at the Old Bailey and with the same look of indifference to human suffering, extended a bony wrist with a pincushion attached to it like a wristwatch. He took 3 and jabbed them malevolently into the material. Millie swore fearfully. Mind where you're putting those pins? What do you think I am, a blay yoga? You must stand still, dear. Undulations will get you nowhere, Hyde Clark said. Now, apologies for my narration of this really quite entertaining scene. And this is how he opens his book, and you're really being drawn into a comedy of all the characters. And his sentences aren't overwritten at all. They're very efficient and yet full of life and full of character. And one of the ways, did you notice what change in the pace from the description to when he started with the dialogue and the interaction between the people in the room? And it's the way, and you can get a sense of all the energy and the flurry that's happening between these people. Dialogue is your friend. Dialogue is an event. Dialogue is a type of action. When people are talking, something is happening. And it can really add character and add flavour to your writing, to bring it to life, make it jump off the page. So dialogue, it adds pace. It breaks the page visually, actually, because it's got shorter lines, obviously, other than just big wads of paragraphs of prose. It reveals character as well by the way you write. You can get a sense of who these people are by the way they interact with each other and the words they use. You can use it to advance the plot. People often, as I talked about with information dumps before, they'll do it through the dialogue. And think back and notice also when you're reading stories or looking at movies, what are they telling you in the dialogue? Rather than just doing that telling, they do it in showing through dialogue. It can make people seem more real. And there are people who actually go around with their little scratch pads, or little notepads all the time, recording people's dialogue, because it's quite an art to make it actually seem quite real and actually use words that people say instead of words that are scripted the way you write on a page. It's very different to the way people speak. They're almost like different languages. And when you let people speak in the way they would normally speak, suddenly they seem rounded, they seem real. And it gives a sense of action, as I say. Things are unfolding when people talk. So tips: people don't talk grammatically. They don't talk in a way that's grammatically correct. They'll use short sentences. They'll complete each other's sentences. They'll often use grammatical errors. It's certainly, they would say I know I say but that's the way people talk. They don't talk properly and they don't talk correctly. So if you listen to the way people talk, and when you're writing dialogue, it's going to help you to actually let yourself not worry about writing it correctly, because you're writing it the way people talk. Sometimes people actually go so far as to use phonetic spelling, and that can be hard to read. So, maybe test that out if you're going to go that far. And maybe the odd little bit of phonetic or language can colour it. But in general, you don't necessarily need to go that far to nevertheless recreate the sense of a natural flowing, if haphazard sometimes, conversation as they are. And different people talk differently. This is the other thing you'll notice when you're listening to dialogue. Some people are eloquent, others are really loud, and others are monosyllabic. So you can actually indicate your character by the way they talk. Are they incessant talkers who just talk about themselves all the time and don't ever listen to people? Are they completely zipped up and really hard work to get a conversation out of? So think about your character and the way they talk and what that will reveal about them. Don't think you have to transcribe what people say. I went, this is like the 24-hour principle. Oh, yes, I went to the doctor's today and I was sat there and I was reading the magazine about, sometimes, conversations are not always interesting. And in fact, the interesting part of that conversation is, well, if the person is sharing it, if they're intimate, what happened with the diagnosis. So you only need to include the highlights. You don't always need to spell things out either. Just as you can sometimes show a lot by intimating things in your descriptions, you can also do that in dialogue. Remember that often there are uncomfortable silences, and people do leave things sometimes hanging in the air. And they will add a real sense of atmosphere and a dynamism and a nuance and subtlety to your writing as well if you include those layers of conversations. And you can just summarize the other bits. It really helps people if they don't have to read all the less important details. And I said, you don't need to include, even though people say you don't always need to include that bit like phonetic spelling. You don't necessarily need to include that. You can, if you want to. And also remember, now this is a tricky thing because you have to make it clear who's talking. But people don't always say, hi, Amy. Oh, hello, John. Thank you, Amy. How are you? So this is a little bit of an art, but look at how the other writers do it. And maybe just do it once or twice, pepper it in there, and do other things like Sarah came running down, have them do actions and refer to them in the sentence so we know who's talking at a certain time. And that rather than she claimed, she exhaled, she declared, often it's best to say she said or he said, she asked, he asked. And as I said, here the variation on that is by, giving an idea of what they're thinking or what they're doing. And so if you want to have a break between said and asked. But often the most effective is said and asked. So thinking about your pieces that you've been writing, have you been telling stories where you've had friends involved, or you wanting to tell a story with friends involved? Have you had dialogue? Because this is something I often see when I'm reading people's drafts, is they'll have a scene where there's more than one or two people there, but they're not interacting. And yet, if you start to let them interact and start to let them talk as you would normally, those pieces just really come to life and jump off the page. So look back at the pieces that you've been writing thus far and think or if you're thinking ahead of a story that you want to tell with friends, what sort of dialogue scenes might you have? And I encourage you to think about adding dialogue, adding action as well, the principles we're talking about further, and using those to balance your description. It is a bit of an art to be able to write natural dialogue. This is purposely stilted dialogue, but it's a good indication of what can easily happen, particularly if you're writing on a laptop or a computer and you write as you would for the printed page or the online page, not for a conversation. So you might end up with a sentence like this. Yes, I do want a cookie with my milk. I would also like a sandwich. Chocolate chip, okay. Yes, chocolate chip would be good. Please give me 2 chocolate chip cookies and 1 very large glass of milk. I will eat them at the kitchen table. I cannot sit at the dining room table. This is a child, by the way. You talk kind of funny for a kid. He interviewed. I am only 4. What do you think a 4-year-old should sound like? Maybe you're the one who talks kind of funny. Have a go. I'm going to give you a few minutes now, and I won't say anything for a couple of minutes, and just have a go rewriting that to be a bit more natural. How would a 4-year-old really talk about cookies with milk? Okay, for those who might be listening to this while they're doing other things, I'm not going to dwell too much on that exercise right now, but hopefully even that time gave you enough of a impetus to have a go, and I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to do a better job than that one I just put together there. Um, and but it's really just a highlight to you that it is a different style of writing, and that's for that reason. If it's something that you're not familiar with, I do encourage you to start listening to dialogue and listen to it the way that other people talk, and the characters who are like the characters you're going to have in your story. Listen to the way they talk and the phrases they use, and then you can start to give yourself a bit of a prompt to make them actually your characters in your story talk that way too. Because characters bring your story to life, as we have seen. They really do make a difference to your story. And this is so true with you if you're a journalist as well as a fiction writer. The people that you actually choose to feature in your story or interview can actually transform it. Imagine him compared to business people. It's a completely different story. And this is why access is so important for faction and creative faction, as much as actually good character profiling in fiction. But getting access to those characters is so important, and this is why we're going to spend a bit of time looking at interview skills next week, because they are, for both fiction writers and faction writers, they're really important skills to develop as well. One of the first things that you need to do to think about, and this is just in prep for that, is how do you get the interview in the first place? Because if you're not associated with a high-profile magazine, sometimes that can be quite a challenge. If you are with a known outlet and a trusted outlet, that's a different thing altogether. You might find it easier, but if not, I recommend this. Make it short for the start, and sound confident. Have a script ready. If you just get through to the person you want to talk to, and you're going and you're fluffing around and you don't really get to the point and you're not clear and you don't sound confident, you might lose them. But if you sound like you know what you're talking about and you're interested in them and you're clear, you're going to give them more confidence that you're someone that they should actually maybe think about talking to. But keep it very short. Only ask for no more than 15 minutes at the start. Do you have time for, if I ask you a quick question, or have a chat for 15 minutes? Then if it's going well, they have the option to let it go a bit longer, and 9 times out of 10 they will, but don't intimidate people at first. And a really good way to make people think, well, why should I mean, particularly if they're high-profile celebrities or people in the public eye, they're probably being approached and nagged to get interviews all the time. So your job is a little bit harder, because you've got to try and not only get their interview, but get them interested in spending any bit of time with you when you do get the interview. And the really important thing there is research, and show them that through the questions, or just even the conversations that you have and the questions you ask, that you have done some research and you are interested sincerely in the topic and in them as well. If you've got contacts, by all means, go through them. Anything that you can do to get that access and get that interview. I know when I was working in outback Australia with semi-traditional communities, I definitely went through people who were long-term in the field, like anthropologists and linguists, and that made my job a lot easier to liaise. They'd know what was going on, who were the people to talk to, and they also acted as a bridge for me. So that's why if you're doing some research before you go in, it's a good idea to make those contacts with people who are going to really make your life so much easier in the field. Talk to them about what's in it for them, and think about what's in it for them. People don't always naturally want to give you their time, and why should they? So, for them, particularly if it's a sensitive topic, this is about them getting their chance to have their say if things are being said about them, or a chance to help overcome stigma and shame around an issue. Some people need to come forward and break the silence. So if this is a bit sensitive, these are, some of the things. These are the reasons why people will talk. So think about that before you're talking to them. But don't mislead people. It's unfortunate that is a not uncommon practice in some areas of journalism, and it leaves a trail. It makes it 10 times harder for the next journalist to come in and get an interview, because people have been betrayed and they've thought they were doing one thing and it turns out to be another. I would always be upfront with people about the content of the publication and the context of it as well. And if you're not, people can feel very betrayed because they've given you your time and their time and they've trusted you. So do be careful of that one. Another thing you'll want to do in the field is have a release form. We do have a pro forma on the VLE, and apart from the fact of demonstrating, if it comes to it, that someone has actually agreed to take part in an interview, you've got that as evidence. It's also a really good record of their name and contact details. Believe me, if you're talking to a lot of people over time, you're going to forget. So, not just have who they are and their contact detail, but make a note of what they were and what date, what they did in the well, this was the travel agent that I was talking to. Because otherwise, if you're 6 months down the track or years down the track looking at that name, will mean nothing to you. But if you actually talk about what their role was in the piece, that will help you remember. So it's an administrative function as well as a legal function. Well, I say legal, and I have to admit that when I worked at the ABC, our release firms were not entirely legal. In fact, they wouldn't have stood up in court, and we knew that because they were blanket, and people can't give you permission to do anything. They can't sign away their rights, in fact. But we would hand them to people to try and offset any potential that they would come back and pull their permission later down the track. So, not giving to, unlike it's very different to a university ethics situation. Of course, for university ethics and research work, people always have the right to pull their permission down the track. They can pull out at any time without fear or worry. But in the media, when you're working with budgets and crews and trying to get something to air, there was a practice of having pretty blanket release forms. For your form here, it's not like that, but you are telling people the content and the context, and it's limited to that. It's not like a blanket release form that they're signing their life away forever. We'll come back to this when we do our interview workshop, but go in with your research done and a few questions ready to ask. But also the trap with that is that then you forget to listen. So you have to remember to actually be open to change those questions at any time. And even though you're having a conversation, it's a focused conversation. So we will, as I say, we will come back, but these are some, just a heads up to where we're going to next. One thing to be aware of if you are doing interviews in another country, however, is it does also pay time to spend some time researching different cultural mores. That's often going to be very helpful for you in terms of building up a rapport and trust with people across different cultures, because I don't know if you know, but some cultures think it's revolting to blow into a hanky, and whereas we might look at someone blowing their nose onto the ground and think, "Ooh," they look at us blowing into a hanky and think that's disgusting. So it always pays to know, particularly if you're at a dinner and someone starts burping and looking to you to burp as well, what the context of that is. In some cultures, it's considered scandalous to show anything of the legs, and I'm not talking about necessarily. Well, yeah, some Indian cultures it's not necessarily considered okay. So be conscious of what you're wearing, because it might put your make your interviewees ill at ease. This is about establishing a rapport and establishing a relationship with them as well. But also Romani communities, Traveller communities don't always like to show above the elbow. So there you go, interesting things like that would make them very uncomfortable if that part of the body was bare. Some communities are not very comfortable with direct eye contact. They see it as disrespectful. They might be aware that a Westerner wouldn't be versed in that practice, but if they're not making eye contact with you, don't necessarily assume it's because they're lying or because they're not engaging. It might be something else again. Some cultures feel it incredibly inappropriate to ask direct questions, and Japan is one of those. People tend to go around a topic, and Indigenous communities are similar to that as well. So if that's the case, if you're going into a culture that tends to go around a topic, many, many times rather than actually going straight to, if you go in and start asking direct questions, you may not get what you need either. And again, this is just a matter of listening as much as speaking. In some cultures, speaking is expected, and if you're not speaking a lot, you might be considered suspiciously. In other cultures, speaking too much might alienate you from the people. So again, it's always worth spending a little bit of time investigating the cultural mores of where you're going, particularly if you are looking to make relationships in that place and conduct some interviews. So finally, we are coming to the end of our makeup lecture. I hope you enjoy. I believe a few of you are having a semester break this week anyway, so perhaps my week at the conference was good timing. But just as an overview, with the submission that's coming up on November 6th, just to finish off, this is from the handout. Make sure you do go back and check the handout and double check that you're ticking off all the bases there before you submit. But it should be typed in a 12-point font size using 1.5 spacing. Please make sure that you have a header or footer on each page and you have your student number, not your name, please. And remember to just number your pages as well. If you do qualify for a special consideration, please include an inclusive marking sheet at the front, and that's in the module information folder as well. It's a Harvard system for referencing, and you can find links to the University of Leeds Harvard Style online. If you do want an extension, if you've got reasonable grounds, normally you need to request it a week in advance. So next Monday, October 30, I believe, is the one that you would want to be sending a extension request form by. If you've got reasonable grounds, that's fine. If you haven't got an extension and you are late, there's a penalty of 5 marks per day. Remember, before you upload, to proofread and correct your assignment, because that can be frustrating if you lose a few marks simply by forgetting to do that. I always find, for me, because I can miss things, that it's always good to leave it a day or at the very least a few hours and come back and make sure I read it out loud when I come back as well. You submit via Turnitin on the VLE. The assessment link is already live, but you don't have to submit till 11:59 p.m. on Monday, November 6th. There's a 10% leeway on the total word count. And as we discussed in class, the blog and discussion board, your creative writing excerpts should be between 200 and 400 words, and any quotes from the reading no more than 100 words in total. Remember, there's a 10-item annotated bibliography to be inserted as an appendix at the end. At least 8 of them should be from the readings. And you should also have a collation page where you cut and paste all your creative writing excerpts and tally up the word count for those, which should be between 200 and 400 words. And if you could also, at the end of that, cut and paste all your creative writing posts, and you can include your discussion board posts in that, and just have them as an appendix. As I say, that's not assessed, but it's just good evidence of what you've been doing as just an overall. So if you could please include that would be great. To help prepare, as I say, just a reminder, you can send me a bullet point draft by 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday, November the 1. That can have one sample prose paragraph, but basically in bullet point overview would be great. I am at that conference and in transit that day, so I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out for your emails if you've got questions, but my best day for communicating with everyone is on that Thursday, November the 2nd. So if you've got questions, it's a good day to email me about them. You might also want to decide amongst your group to send each other your final drafts before you submit, or if not the whole group of 4, perhaps you could do that in pairs. So if you want to, I encourage you to think about that. Don't worry about posting your rewritten dialogue snippet to the discussion board, because we can do that in a group class, but it might be something that hopefully might lead to some other exercises and creative work. And just as a thought, remember that first story when we first started, you talked about one of your peak travel experiences. Well, why don't you have a go rewriting that if you want to? If you get sick of writing up your summary, rewrite that and incorporate some of the strategies and techniques that we've been discussing and introducing in our classes over the last few weeks. And then if you get all of that done, feel free to start looking at the case studies for the following week, which are actually Japanese video bloggers or vloggers, which is another really popular and growing genre that has created a whole lot of micro celebrities who are actually making their living from blogging. But we'll look at that, as I say, in future weeks. So I hope you're enjoying the process, and thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to seeing you again. And that's it for now.